If you like audiobooks or audio shows, check out a free trial of Audible.
Welcome to Mind Shock. This is your host, Bruce Maguire, and today we are taking a look at a very critical topic. That is absolutely everything on the decline? I mean, every single industry, the economy as a whole, quality of life, life expectancy, is absolutely everything on the decline. Why or why not? I mean, it certainly looks that way, and if it is that way, we'll examine that. And if it looks that way and actually isn't, why does it look that way? What are the factors? And we will, of course, be examining all of this in typical Mind Shock fashion with logic and reason at the forefront. If you want to help support the channel, you can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. You can also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Access to exclusive streams and chats. Help support the channel that way. And, of course, make sure you're subscribed. Hit the bell for notifications. Make sure your device allows those notifications to come through. If they're still not coming through, just like and comment on more videos. That's how the YouTube algorithm sends out the notifications. It does appear to not work perfectly. You could also just go to youtube.com/mindshock. Questions, comments, theories, thoughts, suggestions, rebuttals, debunkings of any kind, leave them in the comment section. And like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. Patrons who get priority for case topic, logical analysis, co-podcast, or requests. You can also be a guest on the podcast depending on your tier. Okay. So what should we start with initially? The economy. I mean, inflation is just so out of control. And for the people that say, oh, it's better now than it was last year, does that really mean anything? Like... If there's a monsoon and your house gets completely demolished, and the monsoon's continuing for week after week after week, and on this particular week, the monsoon is slightly less powerful and doesn't knock everything over, and you're like, yeah, but the monsoon's not as bad as it was. But that's not what's being compared. We're not comparing the past couple of weeks. We're taking a look. Let's look at an entire generation. The span of a generation, or even two, or even three, is everything on the decline. Obviously, looking at something today versus yesterday, or even, this month versus last month, or even this year versus last year, I mean, that's way too narrow of a focus to get a good idea of what's going on. You have to zoom out to get the big picture. If you're looking at a tiny, tiny little slice, you're not really going to get an accurate depiction of anything. So, again, just looking at the decline of the purchasing power of the dollar. I talk about this on a couple different podcasts. Over 100 years or so ago, you could buy a house outright on just a regular job, not any kind of super high-paying job, just a regular average job. Houses were what, like $5,000? Salaries were like, whatever, $12,000 a year? So an average salary. Now, if an average salary is like 30, 40, 50, 60K, that means a decent single-family home should be half of that if you want to compare it to the purchasing power of the dollar 100 years ago, or not even 100 years ago. And so, I mean, I don't know how anybody could argue that. Because the average wage has not increased anywhere near to match the decline of the purchasing power of the dollar, inflation. The greatest tax of all that nobody talks about as a tax. But it is the biggest tax. Because your work is not resulting in purchasing power dollar to dollar versus previous generations. So everything's vastly more expensive. People need 2-3 jobs just to keep up, unless you're, happen to have an extremely high-paying job. But even the people with extremely high-paying jobs, usually they have a lifestyle to match, other than the exceptions. They usually have a lifestyle to match, so they're still not necessarily... there's a lot of people making a ton of money, 6-7 figures, that actually might be broke on paper. Because if they have all these vehicles and boats and vacation homes, they might not actually have anything liquid. because their paycheck is going into supporting all that. And maybe, let's say they do have a tiny little bit of savings. Is it that negligible that, again, in previous generations, like let's compare apples to apples, the rich people 100 years ago, in their position, the cream of the crop, was their paycheck stretched that thin for a lavish lifestyle? No, it wasn't, because again, the purchasing power of the dollar. So the economy clearly on the decline. You could say there've been, the real deception here on unemployment, I'm not really going to go into that. That probably deserves its own episode. Because if somebody has an extremely high-paying job, some PhD with a high-paying job, now post-COVID, however you want to quantify it, now they were maybe unemployed, but now they have a job that they're getting a fraction of what maybe they even work at McDonald's. I mean, there are PhDs who are currently working at McDonald's. I actually talked to one, simply because they couldn't get hired at a high-paying job, PhD and all. So now they're no longer counted as unemployment. How deceptive are those statistics? A bunch of people went back to work making a fraction of what they used to, and that's considered good for the economy? But all the gullible goofs fall for that kind of statistic manipulation. And then also people not receiving unemployment benefits. I mean, how are they counted? Most of them are not. So there's a lot of issues with the counting of the unemployment. So on paper, it might not even be that accurate of a recovery. But even if you accept that a certain amount of people have more jobs than they used to over the past few years, what kind of jobs are they? Why are we not comparing apples to apples? If they're making that much less money, they had to sell their home, buy a much smaller home or apartment, their quality of life plummeted, and the goofs can only point, oh, look, there's less unemployment than there was before. Meanwhile, everything, absolutely everything has declined. What does that all mean? Even across the arts, I mean, this is a huge one. And this is one I really wanted to get into, because you have a lot of people thinking that they made some kind of intelligent counter by saying, oh, there's this super quality film, or there's this amazing musician that just came out. So music's not on the decline. Okay, so let's dismantle that notion right now. What does decline even mean? So let's look at movies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So the bulk of the movies. So you had, let's say, 60% of films were pretty quality and rising in quality. You had better acting, better storylines, better special effects, just better creativity, better directing craft, acting craft, believability across the board, just entertainment value, just all going up, 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 all the way through the 90s. You could maybe argue the early years of the 2000s. I don't know if anybody's arguing 2010 plus. Maybe not even 2005 plus. I mean, that's, that could be, you could split hairs there. But throughout the 90s, everything was on the up and up. So you would still, so let's say, whatever it was, 50, 60, 70% were following this trend. Then you had the top 1%, the cream of the crop that was just amazing, the greatest movies of all time being made. And then you had a nice solid anywhere between around 20% of just bottom of the barrel garbage. And even take the worst movies of, let's say, the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, the absolute worst. How much better are they now than the absolute worst schlock made, not just today, but even from the early 2000s? I mean, because obviously direct to video, the consumer camcorder becoming cheaper. I mean, literally everybody was making movies in the early 2000s with and without film school. But I mean, a lot of film school students were making pure trash too. So that garbage that was coming out, you had a much higher percentage of garbage, and the exponential rate of trash, it's not comparable, because even in the 60s, 70s, 80s, you had to shoot on film. It's your only option. So there was a certain level of minimum quality that was attained. I mean, even if they were horrible, horrible films, there was some kind of baseline. And you could argue, again, just with the advent of the cheaper cameras and digital video in the 90s, that the second half of the 90s, you were starting to see some pure garbage that was just I mean, there was no baseline. The floor fell through and then it fell through again. And post 2000, it fell through another infinite floors, where you're looking at just pure, unadulterated garbage. Same thing with music. After auto-tune, literally any schmuck throws on the auto-tune, or even, you could argue, and this might get some flack, mumble rap. I'm actually a pretty big fan of real rap. I like pretty much every music genre. I'm a pretty big fan of just about every music genre, with obviously certain exceptions within the genre, except for mumble rap. And it's not just mumble rap. Mumble rap crossed over into regular pop music, where you just have singers just making weird noises and talking gibberish in just the lowest IQs making this. I mean, look at just the decline in quality. I mean, take some kind of raw audio cassette recorded on the street from the 90s in the rap genre or even other genres. I mean, there's just no comparison. The creativity, the originality, the flow, everything is so vastly superior, except the production quality, of course. Now you have really much higher production quality. You have a baseline of production quality, even for film and music. I mean, there's exceptions for that too. Obviously, you can find some absolute scraping the bottom of the barrel 1% where they don't have the production quality either, and it's trash. So you obviously could find that. But let's talk about the bulk, the 50 to 70%. How much worse is the bulk today versus the bulk in the previous generations? That's really what we're getting at here. That's the main point. I don't know how anyone could argue that the bulk is superior. Obviously today with all of the advanced technology, and there are super geniuses out there, the top 1% of films, I still don't know if you could say they're better than previous generations in terms of emotional impact, or, having a soul, so to speak, or even entertainment value to a certain extent. I mean, people, the younger generation, if they haven't seen any older movies, if this is all they know, they might think it's incredibly entertaining. But I mean, the fun vibe of, for example, 80s movies, I mean, that's kind of hard to replicate today. I mean, you can imitate, you can get close, but does it really capture the spirit of something actually made in the 80s? Because there was just an era. Some people, there's a lot of argument here. Some people believe the 90s was the last great decade. Now, you could still argue that and say the 80s was a better decade than the 90s, but the 90s was the last great decade. Now, the 80s, people argue the 80s was the last decade of just extreme optimism. Let's put it that way. I mean, the early 90s, it's kind of hard to split decades, because the early 90s was pretty similar to the 80s. The late 80s, early 90s, pretty similar, like 90, 91, 92. I guess around 93, 94, there was a technological shift. I mean, obviously the internet existed. People were on the internet in the 80s. I mean, a lot of people don't know that. They were, just not a large percentage. In this really early 90s, also not that much, but around the mid-90s was the shift. I mean, I don't know. We probably should look up the stats on the migration onto the internet. If I had to guess, I would say 93, 94 really saw an influx of a lot of users. Whereas 90, 91, 92, I just do not remember anybody just randomly talking about the internet. 93, I'm not sure. 94, there was definitely, I would say 94 if I had to just randomly pick a year. I guess it depends on where you were too. If you were in the, city versus country. I mean, there's places in the countryside where the internet's still not really a thing. They don't have internet. I mean, the U.S. is a big place, and of course other countries as well. I would say 94 was the shift. So I would say up to 93, there was just a sense of optimism. And it kind of fizzled through the late 90s. I don't know if it was because of grunge and just this kind of the rise of goths. I mean, I don't know. There was definitely a shift in the later half of the 90s. But the 80s was just a decade of optimism. That's how many people have described it. There was a fun vibe. Everybody, obviously not everybody, but in general, there seems to have just been a general feeling of happiness, upbeat happiness, and that was reflected in the movies, the music, for the most part. Obviously, we're not talking about exceptions or subgenres. And I would say that was still present in the early 90s. 94 was probably the beginning of maybe some kind of a flatlining on that regard where there wasn't constantly increasing optimism. And maybe it kind of dropped off. Maybe it kind of dropped off for the latter part of the 90s, but it was still there. And then obviously, I guess 9/11 would be the mass consciousness shift point, the rise of police states, etc. That kind of everything snowballed from there. But yeah, even in like 98, 99, 2000, I don't know if you could say that really just was not the same vibe as the 80s. It just wasn't as upbeat and fun. Everything got grungy. I mean, even The Matrix, obviously, utilizing internet, online, advanced technology. And then, yeah, I mean, social media to an extent, even though it wasn't exactly what it is today. You know, just people discussing things on the internet. I would say the only way... I would say the speed of the internet, because in the late 80s, I mean, internet speed was nothing. I mean, you had to use your phone line, and you couldn't be on the phone. So... it wasn't part of a plugged-in 24/7 cycle. It was kind of like almost like a special event that you had to go on the internet for. So it wasn't even people that were kind of got a second phone line and they were on the internet a lot. It's still weird because it's still kind of like they still went out and had a real life to an extent. Now, there were the hardcore nerds. You can find the outliers. Of course, you can find the outliers. But look at the average kid today, not an outlier, an average kid just permanently plugged into screens, tablets, phones, computers, playing games, YouTube, whatever. Just constant screen time frying the brain where they just don't socially interact. And as fun and as escapist video games are, because they always were. I mean, there were video games in the 80s, there were video games in the 70s. It's not that they're not fun. The best way I can kind of describe it, this is probably the best way I can put it, and all the Mind Shock listeners out there can add in their thoughts here. In the past generations, all the way throughout the 80s, maybe even the early 90s, and, you know, depending on the people, how much of a family life they had, video games and even movies and TV shows, they were kind of an addition. They were a fun addition, not a replacement for exciting and a fulfilling and exciting, happy life. Whereas now, so it was always escapism, it was always fun. It was kind of like, yeah, it was kind of just like an addition to your life. Now it's almost like it's been a replacement for a real life. That's the best way I can describe it in terms of the younger generation just always being on screens. And even Gen Xers. Even Gen Xers have increased their screen time, of course. And people just it seems like everybody's living less of a real life and more of an online life. I mean, whatever happened to that game? Is it still around Second Life or whatever? That was kind of like, it's weird. It's almost like it was more than just a name. It was almost like that shifted everybody. Like they were literal millionaires with real properties in their lives playing this Second Life game where they're investors and buying up properties. Like they're already doing that. I mean, that's like a weird thing because you could argue like, you know, young broke kids playing that game, they're just having fun with escapism. But even older people who actually did some of this stuff in real life were doing it in the game. It's kind of a weird thing. I mean, I would argue if you live that much of a fulfilling, exciting life, why would you be engaging in escapism? Now, for kids, it's a little different because they're not really living a real life. It's almost like they're in prison. They have to go to school. They have to do their chores. They have to do this, that. I mean, not all kids, not all families, but in general, a kid is not an adult. They don't have a car. They can't just go do whatever they want whenever they want. They can't go get a job if they're a minor. There are only so many hours they could work part-time or whatever the laws are. The rules are different when you're a kid versus an adult. So for kids, it's almost like video games. There's more of a place for it. I mean, I know some people argue that kids shouldn't play games either, but you could kind of argue that there's a certain fun to be had, particularly in Grand Theft Auto. You can run people over and kill people, get that out of your system for fake, so you never really have to do it for real. And since you actually can't, well, hopefully in their mind, it's not an option to do it in real life. So you do it in the game instead and have a bunch of fun doing it in the game. Then you become an adult, you have a real life, you do real things. So yeah, you could make that argument. And is this all connected in the decline where human beings are just so disconnected from reality and how much of their life they're losing, not just behind screens, but I mean, this extends even into the workplace. I mean, in generations past, you didn't have everybody working overtime. You didn't have this glorification of hustle culture or grind culture where just people working endless hours at jobs just to make more money while inflation goes up and up so they can never truly catch up. So that's really the main point. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue that absolutely everything is on the decline. I mean, even quality of life when you can't afford to do anything. Now, certain things, it's not that they cost money. I mean, going to like nice parks or certain beaches or whatever, you're not necessarily going to spend money at a hotel, but it's still, with gasoline prices being expensive, all the tolls on the road. I mean, even compare the tolls on the roads today versus 80 years ago. I mean, it's just absolute insanity across the board, seeping into every aspect of everybody's life. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be happy otherwise. I mean, you could always adapt. Humans have always adapted. I mean, humans living in the worst conditions possible still found ways to have fun and enjoy their life to a certain extent. And obviously, you know, conditions today in first world countries are still better than, you know, some of these industrialization cities of the 1800s, people living in extreme poverty with not even any kind of food to eat. But, and that's another topic, food. I mean, look at the decline in nutritional value per gram of food, like an apple today versus an apple 100 years ago. And it's just, yeah, it's just crazy. Not just price, but quality, nutritional value. Everything is plummeting across the board. I mean, even, and then naturally that's going to extend to even birth rates because less people are not just capable of having children, but even the people that are capable are not having children. So literally everything, including the population, is on the decline in the Western world, at least. Obviously, there are certain groups of people who are having a lot of kids, but for the most part, just addressing the main Western populace for the purpose of this podcast. So, yeah, I mean, and let's round this out with this, just basic intelligence levels. I've talked about this before. Just because of the sheer amount of information and knowledge available today, the top 0.01% of geniuses today, they might be a lot smarter than the top 0.01% of geniuses 100 years ago. Maybe, I'm not even sure about that. But just because a lot of these so-called knowledge bases are actually houses of cards that aren't real, like, you know, Einstein's relativity fraud and all that stuff. If you haven't checked that on the Mind Shock podcast, check that out. And so, yeah, it's not that they might not necessarily be smarter, but let's give it to them. Let's give it to the people who think people are smarter today. What about the bulk of people? The 60 to 80%, the masses. The masses, are they dumber on average than the masses 100 years ago? I would argue yes, because even if on paper they're not, if 100 years ago they didn't have internet and they didn't have all of these resources to clearly see how propaganda works, how the cult of state worship hoodwinks and enslaves everybody. 100 years ago, you'd have to go to a library or find a book. I mean, these books might have been banned, you know, Lysander Spooner books or whatever. But now with the internet, everybody's got it on their phone in their pocket. There's no excuse. So I would argue the average person is way dumber today simply because if 100 years ago, I think if the average goof had the technology that is available today, they would have utilized it to a greater extent that people are utilizing it now. Again, I can't prove it. These are just random musings from the one and only Bruce Maguire. Everybody can feel free to chime in, give their thoughts, theories, rebuttals, or debunking of anything I have said on any category. But can anyone think of anything of any topic that's of any area of life that's not on the decline? I mean, maybe computing power, like technological computing power. But I mean, you could argue, I mean, theoretically, NASA went to the moon with 60s technology, and yet a human has not walked on the moon since. What does that mean? Even lunar landing technology is on the decline. I mean, if they even did that, obviously. If you haven't checked out the Mind Shock podcast on that, check it out on the arguments for the moon landing and logically analyzing all that. But yeah, computer-based technology. I mean, I don't know. We could argue, processors are getting faster and cheaper. Moore's law, of course. Hard drives are getting smaller with more amounts of space. So yeah, I mean, certain areas of technology are moving forward. Yeah, I mean, resolutions, internet speeds. Yeah, I mean, that's the only thing I can really think of. Can anybody think of anything else? We'll see. Hope everybody enjoyed another edition of the Mind Shock podcast. You want to help support the podcast? You can donate to our PayPal. Just check the link in the description. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that bell for notifications, or just go to youtube.com/mindshock. You could also become a YouTube member right here on YouTube. Help support the channel that way. And like and share Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Patreon. This is Bruce Maguire signing off. Catch you guys next time.